rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windshield as I drove along the winding road that led to the old lake house. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water into blurry streaks that made it hard to see. It had been years since I'd been back, and the memories of my childhood summers spent at the lake were a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. The lake house had been abandoned for over a decade, ever since my parents passed away. After that, I couldn't bring myself to return. The place held too many memories, both good and bad, and it had always felt like the house itself didn't want to let go. But now, with no other options, I had decided to come back. I needed a place to stay, and the lake house was the only place left that I could call mine. The road was narrow, lined with dense woods on either side, and the rain made everything look darker, more oppressive. I knew I was getting close when I saw the old, rusted sign for the lake road, half hidden by overgrown bushes. I turned onto the gravel path, the tires crunching over loose stones as I made my way deeper into the woods. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something up ahead, a small figure standing by the side of the road. I squinted through the rain, trying to make out what I was seeing. It was a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing there in the pouring rain, his clothes soaked through. His head was bowed, and his dark hair clung to his forehead. I slowed the car, feeling a pang of concern. What was a child doing out here in this weather, so far from any houses or towns? I pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down the window, letting the cold rain spray in. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, but the boy didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, his head still bowed. I turned off the engine and grabbed an old jacket from the passenger seat, stepping out into the rain. The cold hit me like a slap, and I hurried over to the boy, holding the jacket out to him. "Hey, you shouldn't be out here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you lost?" The boy finally looked up at me, and the sight of his face made my heart skip a beat. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were dark, hollow pits. Water dripped from his hair and clothes, but he didn't shiver or seem affected by the cold at all. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at me, as if he were staring straight through me. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice flat, emotionless. I hesitated, feeling a creeping sense of dread. "To the lake house," I replied, pointing down the road. "It's just a few miles from here." The boy's expression didn't change, but he tilted his head slightly, as if considering my answer. "You shouldn't go there," he said quietly. "It's not safe." My unease grew stronger, but I couldn't just leave him out here in the rain. "Why don't you come with me?" I suggested. "I can take you somewhere safe, or we can call your parents." The boy shook his head slowly. "They won't find you if you go there," he murmured, almost to himself. A chill ran down my spine. "Who won't find me?" I asked, but the boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without another word. I stood there in the rain, staring after him, my mind racing. Something about the encounter left me deeply unsettled, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe the boy was just trying to scare me, or maybe he wasn't right in the head. Either way, I couldn't just abandon my plan. I needed a place to stay, and the lake house was the only option. I got back into the car, shivering as I turned the heater on full blast. The boy's words echoed in my mind, but I pushed them aside and continued down the road. The rain didn't let up, and the darkness seemed to close in around me as I drove. Eventually, I saw the familiar shape of the lake house come into view, half hidden by the trees. The place looked even more rundown than I remembered, the paint peeling and the windows covered in grime. The dock by the lake was barely visible through the downpour, its wooden planks warped and sagging. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain drummed against the roof of the car, but inside it was eerily quiet. I took a deep breath and stepped out, pulling the collar of my jacket up against the rain as I made my way to the front door. The door was stiff, swollen with years of neglect, but I managed to shove it open. The inside of the house was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out, or maybe the lines had been cut long ago. I would have to make do with the flashlight I had brought along. I moved through the house, shining the beam of light over the dusty furniture and cobwebbed corners. The place looked like it had been frozen in time, as if the last inhabitants had left in a hurry and never returned. The memories came flooding back. Summers spent swimming in the lake, late-night ghost stories around the fire. But now, those memories felt distant, tinged with an undercurrent of fear. I found an old lantern in the kitchen and managed to get it lit, the weak flame casting flickering shadows across the walls. I set it on the table and tried to warm myself by the small fire I managed to get going in the old stove. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and the wind rattled the old wooden frame of the house. As I sat there, trying to shake off the cold and the unease, I thought about the boy on the road. His words gnawed at me, refusing to be dismissed. Who was he? And what had he meant about it not being safe? I couldn't help but feel that there was something I was missing. Something just out of reach. Suddenly I heard a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The house was supposed to be empty. I hadn't seen any sign of anyone else being here, but the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly made my way up the creaking stairs, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The tapping grew louder as I reached the top of the stairs, echoing down the long, dark hallway. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached the last door at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the tapping stopped abruptly. I shone the light into the room, revealing a small, dusty bedroom. The bed was made, the sheets yellowed with age, and the window was cracked open, letting in the cold, damp air. I stepped inside, scanning the room for any sign of what had made the noise, but it was empty. The only sound was the rain beating against the window and the wind howling outside. I was about to turn and leave when I saw it, a small, wet footprint on the wooden floor, leading to the open window. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the footprint was too small to belong to an adult. It was a child's footprint, still fresh, the water pooling in the grooves of the wood. A sense of dread washed over me, and I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I had been alone in the house, or so I thought. But now, with the memory of the boy on the road and the fresh footprint on the floor, I wasn't so sure. I hurried back downstairs, the sense of unease growing stronger with each step. I needed to get out, to leave the house and never come back. But as I reached the front door, I heard the tapping again, this time coming from the front porch. I swung the door open, the flashlight beam slicing through the rain. The boy was standing there, his clothes still soaked, his dark eyes fixed on mine. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that same empty, hollow expression. I took a step back, fear gripping me. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and pointed towards the lake, his gaze never leaving mine. I followed his gesture, the light from the flashlight barely illuminating the dark waters beyond the trees. And then I saw them, shadows, figures moving slowly through the rain, their forms indistinct but unmistakable. They were coming from the lake, dozens of them, emerging from the water and moving towards the house. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the boy was suddenly in front of me, blocking my path. His face was inches from mine now, and I could see the water dripping from his pale skin, the dark circles under his eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I pushed past him, my heart racing, and ran out into the night. The shadows were getting closer, moving faster now, and I could feel the cold, damp air closing in around me. I stumbled to the car, fumbling with the keys, and managed to get the door open. I threw myself inside and started the engine, my hands shaking as I slammed the car into gear. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the figures that were now just feet away from me. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the wet gravel before finally catching and propelling the car forward. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, as I sped down the road, the boy's words echoing in my mind. The lake house faded into the darkness behind me, swallowed by the trees and the rain. And as I drove, I knew that I would never return, that I had left something behind in that house, something that would never let me forget the night I saw the boy on the road and the shadows that came from the lake. After my grandmother passed away, the family gathered at her old house to sort through her belongings. It was a bittersweet task, filled with memories that seemed to linger in every corner of the house. She had lived there for as long as I could remember, and it felt strange to think of the place without her in it. As we sorted through her things, it became clear that no one was particularly eager to tackle the basement. The basement had always been a place of mystery for me as a child. It was dark, cold, and filled with the kind of old, forgotten things that seemed to come alive in the shadows. But now, as an adult, I felt a sense of duty to go down there and see what was left. I made my way down the creaky wooden stairs, the air growing cooler with each step. The basement smelled of damp earth and dust, a scent that hadn't changed in decades. I clicked on the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, casting a weak light over the cluttered space. Old furniture, boxes of yellowed papers, and forgotten trinkets were piled up haphazardly, each one a relic of a bygone era. As I began to sift through the boxes, I came across something that caught my eye. It was a large, ornate mirror, half hidden under an old sheet. The mirror was beautifully crafted, with a dark wooden frame intricately carved with twisting vines and flowers. It seemed out of place in the dusty basement, like something that belonged in a grand old house rather than a forgotten storage room. I pulled the sheet off, revealing the mirror in its entirety. The glass was slightly fogged with age, but otherwise it was in perfect condition. I could see my reflection in it, faint and distorted by the grime, but there was something about it that drew me in, something that made it impossible to look away. As I stared into the mirror, memories of my grandmother came flooding back. She had always been superstitious, always warning me about things that seemed silly at the time. "Never look into a mirror at night," she would say, her voice low and serious. "You never know what might be looking back." I had laughed it off back then, thinking it was just one of her many old-fashioned beliefs. But standing there in the dim light of the basement, I felt a chill run down my spine. I could almost hear her voice again, warning me to be careful. I shook off the feeling and decided to take the mirror upstairs. It was too beautiful to leave down here, gathering dust. With some effort, I managed to carry it up the stairs and into the living room, where the light was better. I set it against the wall and took a step back to admire it. The mirror seemed to change in the brighter light. The fog on the glass cleared, revealing a sharp, clear reflection of the room. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The reflection didn't quite match the room around me. It was subtle at first, an odd angle here, a slight difference in the lighting there. But the more I stared, the more I realized that the room in the mirror was not the room I was standing in. A sense of unease settled over me as I moved closer to the mirror, peering into the reflection. The furniture was the same, but the colors were muted, the details somehow wrong. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the background, barely visible in the shadows. It was a woman, her face obscured by the dim light, but I could see her eyes, dark and hollow, staring directly at me. I recoiled, my heart pounding. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. My hands trembled as I looked back at the mirror, but the figure was gone, leaving only my own reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I decided to leave the mirror where it was, hoping that in the light of day it would seem less ominous. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt different without my grandmother in it, colder and emptier. Every creak and groan of the old building seemed amplified, and I found myself lying awake, listening to the sounds of the night. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the living room. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, low and unintelligible, but unmistakably coming from the direction of the mirror. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay in bed, but curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The whispering grew louder as I approached the living room, and I felt a chill settle over me, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. The mirror was still there, leaning against the wall, but the reflection was wrong again. The room in the mirror was darker, the shadows deeper, and in the center of the reflection, the figure stood, closer now, her features more defined. She was an old woman, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her eyes sunken and hollow, and she was staring straight at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with a droning, almost rhythmic chant. The old woman in the mirror raised her hand, pointing directly at me, her mouth moving silently as if she were trying to tell me something. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug, and turned to flee the room. But as I did, I heard a soft, creaking sound behind me. I turned back, and my heart nearly stopped. The mirror was no longer reflecting the room. Instead, it showed a dark, empty space, a void where the figure was now stepping out. She moved slowly, her body twisting and contorting as she emerged from the glass, her eyes locked onto mine. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel her presence behind me, hear the soft rustling of her clothes as she moved closer. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, but my hands were shaking too much to get it open. The whispering was right behind me now, cold breath on the back of my neck. I could feel her there, standing just inches away, reaching out for me. In a blind panic, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and swung it behind me. There was a deafening crash, and the whispering stopped. I turned around, breathless and trembling, to see the mirror shattered on the floor, shards of glass scattered across the room. The old woman was gone, leaving only my own fractured reflection staring back at me from a dozen broken pieces. I stumbled out of the house, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could still feel her presence, still hear the echo of that whispering chant in my ears. I never went back inside. I couldn't. The mirror, or whatever had been in it, had taken something from me that night, something I knew I would never get back. The house was left to decay, its secrets buried with my grandmother. But I knew that somewhere, in the dark corners of that old house, the broken pieces of that mirror still held onto the shadows, waiting for someone else to find them. It was just another late shift at Fairhaven Mental Hospital, the kind of night where the hours dragged on, and the silence became almost unbearable. The hospital was an old, sprawling building, more like a fortress than a place of healing. Built in the early 1900s, its brick walls were thick, its windows small and barred. The place had a reputation, a history whispered about in town, but I never put much stock in ghost stories or local legends. I was here to do my job, nothing more. That night, I was assigned to the East Wing, the oldest part of the hospital. It was where they housed the long-term patients, the ones who had been there for years, some for decades. The wing was mostly quiet, with only a handful of patients still awake, pacing their rooms or muttering to themselves. Most of them were sedated, locked in the hazy world of their own minds. As the hours ticked by, I made my rounds, checking each room, making sure everyone was where they were supposed to be. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, a reminder of just how old the wiring was. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, but underneath it lingered a damp, musty odor that never seemed to go away. Around midnight, I reached room 208, the last one on my list. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. The patient, an older man named Samuel, was known for his silence. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in cryptic, fragmented sentences that never made much sense. He had been in the hospital for over 20 years, a permanent resident of the East Wing. I pushed the door open, peering inside. The room was dimly lit, the single overhead bulb casting a weak glow. Samuel was sitting in the corner, facing the wall, his back to me. His long gray hair hung limply around his face, and his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. "Samuel," I called softly, stepping into the room. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch at the sound of my voice. I walked closer, feeling a strange sense of unease. Something about the way he was sitting, so still and rigid, sent a chill down my spine. "Samuel, are you okay?" Still, no response. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but as soon as my hand made contact, he jerked violently, turning his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a terror I had never seen before. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They're in the walls." A cold shiver ran through me. I had seen Samuel scared before, but this was different. This was pure, unadulterated fear. "Who's here, Samuel?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer, just kept staring at me with those wide, terrified eyes. I backed away, suddenly eager to get out of the room. "I'll be right back," I said, more to myself than to him. I left the room and closed the door behind me, the heavy thud echoing down the empty hallway. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that clung to me. I had been working at Fairhaven for a few years, and I thought I had seen it all. But something about tonight felt different. I continued my rounds, trying to put Samuel's words out of my mind. The hospital was silent, the only sounds the soft hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the old building settling. But as I walked through the hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In the stillness of the night, I began to hear things. At first, it was just faint, barely audible noises, scratches, whispers, the soft sound of footsteps. I told myself it was just the building, the old pipes, maybe even the wind. But the sounds grew louder, more distinct, and soon I realized they were coming from behind the walls. I stopped in the middle of the hallway, my heart pounding. The scratching was getting louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The whispers, too, became clearer, a low, murmuring chorus that seemed to be speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I turned around, heading back towards the nurse's station. I needed to report this, needed to get someone else to hear what I was hearing. But as I reached the station, the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging the hospital into darkness. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers were all around me now, growing louder, more insistent. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I scanned the hallway. But the corridor was empty, the only movement, the shadows dancing on the walls. I tried the phone at the nurse's station, but the line was dead. Panic began to set in. I was alone in the dark, surrounded by sounds that shouldn't be there, in a place that suddenly felt suffocatingly small. I decided to make my way back to the security office, where there was an emergency phone line. But as I walked, the sounds seemed to follow me, growing louder with each step. The walls felt closer, the corridor narrower, as if the hospital itself was closing in on me. I reached the security office, but the door was locked. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and slip inside. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. The room was silent, the only light coming from the small emergency lantern on the desk. I crossed the room and picked up the phone, dialing the number for the main hospital. But there was no dial tone, just a faint, static-filled hum. Suddenly, I heard a soft knock on the door behind me. I froze, my heart racing. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of scratching, like nails dragging down the wood. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just more scratching, more whispers, as if something was right outside the door, waiting for me to open it. I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out, had to find a way out of this nightmare. I grabbed the keys and turned to leave, but the door burst open with a force that sent me crashing to the floor. The flashlight slipped from my grasp and rolled across the room, the beam swinging wildly. In the dim light, I saw them, figures, twisted and distorted, crawling through the doorway, their eyes glowing in the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my footsteps echoing through the narrow hallways. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices filling my ears. The walls seemed to pulse and shift, as if the hospital itself was alive, breathing, watching. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to keep moving. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of the old building. The air grew colder, thicker, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing against me from all sides. Finally, I found myself back at room 208. Samuel's door was wide open, the light from the hallway casting long, eerie shadows inside. I hesitated, the voices growing louder, almost deafening now. But then I heard Samuel's voice, clear and urgent, calling my name from inside the room. "They're here." he whispered again, but this time there was no fear in his voice, only cold, knowing certainty. I stepped into the room, the door slamming shut behind me. The light flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. The whispers filled the room, circling around me, pressing in from all sides. I felt cold hands grab my arms, pulling me down into the darkness. The last thing I heard was Samuel's voice, mingling with the chorus of whispers, telling me that I had been right all along. Something was wrong in Fairhaven, something that had been waiting in the walls for years, and now it had finally been set free. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, I knew that there was no escape from it. The hospital had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before. And now I would be a part of it forever, another voice in the chorus, another shadow in the walls. The night had started off perfectly. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had just left a cozy little restaurant in the heart of the city, the kind of place that felt like a hidden gem. The meal had been delicious, the wine flowed easily, and we laughed more than we had in a long time. It was the perfect way to unwind after a stressful week. But it was getting late, and the city streets were emptying out. We decided to take a taxi home rather than walk the few miles back to our apartment. I hailed the first cab that passed, a beat-up old car that looked like it had seen better days. The driver was an older man with a grizzled beard and deep-set eyes that barely glanced at us as we climbed into the back seat. "Where to?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. I gave him our address, and he nodded, pulling away from the curb with a jerky motion. Emily snuggled up to me, her head resting on my shoulder, and I wrapped an arm around her, feeling content and slightly drowsy from the wine. The city lights flickered past as the taxi weaved through the streets. At first, everything seemed normal. The soft hum of the engine was almost soothing, and the streetlights cast a warm glow over the pavement. But as we drove, I noticed that the driver was taking a different route than usual. The buildings became fewer, the streets darker and narrower. "Hey!" I called out to the driver. "This isn't the usual way. Are you sure you're going the right direction?" The driver didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. A strange sense of unease began to settle in my stomach. I glanced at Emily, but she had drifted off, her breathing soft and steady. I didn't want to wake her, not yet, so I leaned forward and spoke louder. "Hey, I think you're taking the wrong route. Our place is back the other way." The driver finally looked at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes unreadable. "Shortcut," he said curtly. "Don't worry, I'll get you there." Something about his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I settled back into my seat, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger as the taxi turned onto a narrow gravel road, leaving the city lights behind. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her gently. "Wake up." She stirred and blinked up at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What's wrong?" "We're not going the right way. I think something's wrong." Emily sat up, looking around at the dark, unfamiliar surroundings. The trees pressed in on either side of the road, their branches arching overhead like skeletal fingers. The taxi's headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the woods. "Where are we?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't know," I admitted, my pulse quickening. "We need to tell him to turn around." I leaned forward again, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. "Listen, this isn't the right way. You need to turn around and take us back." The driver ignored me, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The road grew rougher, the car bouncing over rocks and potholes. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized that he had no intention of turning back. "Stop the car!" I shouted, reaching for the door handle, but the driver locked the doors with a click, trapping us inside. Emily's eyes widened in fear, and she grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Please, just let us out," she pleaded, her voice trembling. The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving, the road growing narrower and more overgrown. The trees loomed closer, their branches scratching against the windows like claws. The sense of isolation was suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the taxi lurched to a stop, the engine cutting off with a final sputter. We were in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden walls warped and rotting. "Get out," the driver ordered, his voice cold and emotionless. I hesitated, my mind racing. There was no way we were going into that cabin, no way we were going to let him take us any further. But before I could react, the driver turned in his seat and reached under the dashboard, pulling out a long, rusted knife. He pointed it at us, his eyes filled with a dark intensity. "Get out," he repeated, his voice like ice. Emily and I exchanged a terrified glance. We had no choice. Slowly, we unlocked our doors and stepped out into the cold night air. The driver kept the knife trained on us as he climbed out of the car, gesturing towards the cabin. "Inside," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out of this nightmare, but the knife in his hand made it clear that there was no escape. We had to play along, at least for now. We walked towards the cabin, the ground soft and damp beneath our feet. The door creaked as the driver pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell of decay hit us as we stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The driver closed the door behind us, trapping us in the darkness. I could barely see, but I could feel Emily trembling beside me, her hand clutching mine tightly. "Sit down," the driver ordered, his voice coming from somewhere behind us. We groped our way to a corner of the room and sank to the floor, our backs pressed against the cold, damp wall. The driver stood in the center of the room, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the sound of our ragged breathing. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what he wanted, what he was planning to do. But then, without warning, the driver began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "You never should have gotten in my cab," he said, his voice a twisted mixture of amusement and malice. My heart pounded as the reality of our situation hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no way out. No one knew where we were. And this man, this twisted, deranged man, had brought us here for a reason. He stepped closer, the knife glinting in the faint light. Emily's grip on my hand tightened, and I could feel her trembling against me. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't hurt us." The driver didn't respond. He just kept laughing, a sound that echoed off the walls of the old cabin. Then, without warning, he lunged at us, the knife flashing in the darkness. I tried to fight back, tried to protect Emily, but it was no use. The last thing I saw was the glint of the blade, the driver's cold, unfeeling eyes, and the terror on Emily's face. And then, there was nothing but darkness. The old cabin stood silent in the woods, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. The taxi was gone, the driver vanished without a trace, and deep in the woods where no one could hear, the laughter of a madman echoed through the trees, mingling with the cries of those who would never return home.